Civil Rights Project by Sean Jenkins. Hello, my name is Sean, and today I've had the lovely opportunity to interview 5 important people from the 20th century, both good and bad, that shaped our nation's history as we know it today. I am going to go down the list as given by my supervisor, and hopefully I'll gain some insight on these people and the conditions/hardships that they faced during their lives. Let's start with Rosa Parks. Hello, Mrs. Parks. I have heard a lot about you and what you've done for our nation. Can you explain to me what issues you faced and what you were involved in during your lifetime? Why, yes, I can. I was most famous for fighting against segregation in the South, especially in Montgomery, Alabama. In December of 1955, I refused to give up my seat on a full bus to a white person, which was especially defiant considering the bus driver ordered me to. I had no care for him anyways since he had left me out in the rain 12 years earlier. Anyways, I got arrested, and since then I advocated for a better South. A non-segregated South, to say the least. I worked with influential figures of the civil rights movement such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and after I became infamous, I dedicated my role to fighting against public transportation segregation by walking wherever I went. This became known later as the Montgomery bus boycott, and it lasted for quite some time. Fantastic information. I'll write that down. Now tell me, Rosa, what contributions or problems did you make or create during this era of your lifetime? Well, Mr. Sean, victory sometimes comes at a cost. Sometimes in order to experience sweetness, you have to endure a small amount of bitterness. That bitterness came to me in the aforementioned form of me not being treated with adequate amounts of respect. I prominently stood up against those mean white people who hated the blacks, which got me arrested during that bus event. However, it was worth it because it brought attention towards the issue of segregation and equal rights. I got to work with great people in the long run. I peacefully protested mainly in the form of marches and transportation boycotts, yet I also got women involved within the movement and inspired many future famous women to take action such as Coretta Scott King and Katherine Johnson. On top of that, a year after protesting by going on foot everywhere during the Montgomery bus boycott, the protests ended after the court case Browder v. Gale declared segregating buses was unconstitutional. I had won, right before Christmas, too. Inquisitive. All right, Rosa, I have one more question for you, then we will have to move on. What was the lasting impact of your contribution to society? Can you explain how or why you contributed the way you did? That is a great question. I like to think that I raised the bar for getting us closer to that victory of desegregation. I feel like my situation has set that mark, which I believe especially opened the eyes of many, especially the younger generation. A little known fact is that a young woman named Claudette Colvin did something similar to me and refused to give up her seat on a public bus for a white woman. She got arrested as a result, and she was only 15 years old. 15! It made me realize how observant and impressionable the younger generations are. I also observed how my small situation in a city like Montgomery led to large events such as the speech given by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Washington, D.C. in 1963. He had a dream, all right, and that dream came true. Also, one more thing to note is that media coverage and visual representations of social issues were seen on television by the public, which spread awareness on what us blacks were facing. It contributed towards the cause. Great information. I would now like to bring in our second interviewee. As aforementioned by Mrs. Parks, this man is regarded as one of the most, if not the most, influential figures of the civil rights movement. His speeches inspired us all, and he pictured a better nation, a nation where blacks and whites could live together in harmony and equity. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Glad to have you, Martin. Now tell me, what issues were you involved in? Well, of course. As dear Rosa mentioned, I played a prominent role as a major advocate, dedicating my resourcefulness to fighting for equality for blacks. After all, they should have had those rights, especially with 3 amendments for them engraved into the Constitution. I especially focused on Jim Crow laws and wanted to put an end to segregation, or as some of the young folks call it, bury the hatchet. I achieved these goals by creating nonviolent marches and protests against segregation, providing inspirational messages to my fellow kin to keep them going during the struggle, and starting movements to the battle against the harshness of the racist culture in the South. Very enlightening. All of that information has got me intrigued for more. Dr. King, I'd like to ask 2 more questions. They are the same questions I asked Mrs. Parks, but hopefully you can expand upon what she said. Now tell me, what contributions or problems did you make or create during this eventful time? Certainly. I obviously contributed towards wanting to end segregation in the South. I did so by organizing peaceful protests, and my powerful words captivated many Americans. I derived my inspiration from Mohandas Gandhi, as he used peaceful protesting methods prior to me in India for fasting and fighting against the caste system. My father was a reverend, and I hold God and His Word close to my heart. So I pray for change, and I know God has got me during difficult times. I kept people's heads up high and supported African Americans during hardships and other minorities. Your work is unparalleled. Now, one last question, Dr. King. What was the lasting impact of your contribution to society? Can you explain how or why you contributed to society? Well, my life was short-lived. I got killed by an assassin when I was at the peak of my influence, yet I immensely impacted many to take action against the government and racists to end segregation promptly. Shortly after my passing, the Civil Rights Bill of 1968 was signed into order by Lyndon B. Johnson, which downright halted segregation in its tracks for good, and my contributions helped shape social reform for the many decades to come. Thank you. So our next interviewee is President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, I am excited to be speaking with you today. Now tell me, what sorts of issues were you involved in? Thank you for having me. During my presidency, I opted to prevent the further spread of communism during the height of the Cold War in the early 1960s, particularly focusing on our neighbor Cuba and our biggest threat, the Soviet Union. I wasn't really focused on the civil rights back then until my later part of my career. As the youngest president to ever be elected, I had a lot of priorities set upon my back. I encountered during the early years of my presidency tensions with the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro and the attempted Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961, which ultimately failed and caused more problems between the U.S. and the Soviet/Cuba relations. The hostility was apparent to both me and the nations involved. I needed to act fast. I negotiated terms of peace and non-nuclear warfare with Nikita Khrushchev and attempted to stop the stationing of nuclear missiles in Cuba, which came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tensions increased immensely as a result of these huge issues. Fascinating. Now tell me, Jack, what contributions or problems did you make or contribute to during your presidency? That's a good question. I helped the American nation grow as a whole, both politically and socially. Remember how I said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Many Americans were hesitant about having me as a president. However, I proved them wrong, as I took down a sickly and weak Nixon in the debate in the polls and became one of the most popular presidents ever. My charm and wit proved to be effective and gained the attention of many Americans. Minorities believed that I could do a lot of good to support the cause. During my role in office, I made a significant deliverance of a civil rights bill in an attempt to stop segregation, although I was hesitant at first since I wanted to win the respect and vote of the southern states. Many minorities feared at first that I was like all the other presidents, a white man who did not stand up for other races, but I proved them wrong and attempted to work tirelessly to fight for what was right. Interesting. Finally, what was the lasting impact of your contribution? Can you explain how or why you contributed? Unfortunately, I didn't majorly focus on civil rights until the later portion of my presidency. By then, it was cut short by a rifle bullet. My efforts in banning segregation led to great work done by my successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, and laws and bills supporting anti-segregation were put into place shortly after the termination of my presidency and my life. I conversed with Coretta Scott King and wanted to end segregation in education, which was effectively put into place before and after my death. My work was later adherable to many future presidents, such as Lyndon B. Johnson, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan. Thank you. Okay, Our fourth interviewee is a bit different because I have driven to a state penitentiary to meet with him as he is considered a flight risk. This information might be a little bit disturbing. Hello, Mr. James Earl Ray. I've heard a lot of things about you, mostly bad. Can you tell me what issues were you involved in? Fine, I'll talk about it. So obviously I became overnight headline news because I apparently killed Dr. King. Big whoop. Look, some people think I killed him because I'm part of a white supremacist party, wanted to gain fame. Frankly, I don't give a damn what you think. But I'll tell you anyways. The man was fighting for nothing in my eyes. He didn't deserve any rights. I wanted to be famous in the white community by doing something that could be considered heroic, done by no one before. I wanted to be recognized by the National States Rights Party, but apparently I'd be recognized by cast iron bars staring me in the face. Most of all, I wanted to put whites above the blacks. Our race is superior, and I sent a message by killing King. I can see why many disapprove of your character, but I must continue. Tell me, what contributions or problems did you make or create during this era? As I just said, I killed a famous figure, a father in many people's eyes. I started a movement. I am on a higher tier than others. I made those poor little men and women falter. Those who looked up to King could look up no more. He was gone because I did something about it. Civil rights should have never been a thing. However, I'll tell you I didn't expect it to get so out of hand. Minorities started targeting white people for something that I did? Psh, how preposterous. Funny enough, this assassination eventually led to racist targeted assassinations such as Anwar el-Sadat, Robert F. Kennedy, and Yitzhak Rabin. Whatever, I guess. Okay. James, one more question, then I'm out of your hair. What was the lasting impact of your contribution to society? Oh, I like to think that I contributed greatly to society. I got rid of Dr. King. I stunted the progression of the civil rights movement, although it eventually prevailed in the long run. As I said, many people got angry and started riots. Many innocent people died for what? They died for only something that I did? Unbelievable. And on top of that, I guess more famous people, especially political figures, got up protection, which might make it more difficult for one to do something like I did. Anyways, the big problem is that the civil rights movement prevailed and my actions were all for nothing. I'm slowly rotting in a prison. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm done talking to you. You bore me. How rude. Fine, I was done with you anyways. Okay, our final interviewee you could say is up to bat. He changed the game of baseball forever and is one of the most infamous athletes in American history. Greetings, Jackie Robinson. I heard many great stories. Tell me, what issues were you involved in during your experiences you faced? Why, yes, I would love to talk about what I've done. Back when baseball was still in its infancy, I took a big leap forward and opted to be the first black baseball player in the history of the MLB. It was not received well, to say the least. A lot of folks booed me and called me derogatory names. To even fathom taking such a risk as the first black player can't be comprehended by some. My wife must have been scared out of her mind when we received death threats, and she probably thought I was out of my mind. People also thought that I wouldn't be a good player. They thought I would be a weak athlete only because they judged me based on the color of my skin. Well, I proved them wrong, to say the least. I'm glad I'm able to understand this better. Now riddle me this, Jackie. What contributions or problems did you make or create during this period of time? I know these questions seem repetitive, and I apologize for that. It's quite all right. For me, I believe I introduced the competitive and positive spirit of black athleticism within sporting events. I influenced many of the younger generation and indirectly led to people wanting to take prominent action against racist-fueled individuals in sports. Unfortunately, with my introduction, I led to many other players who tried to follow in my footsteps to be bombarded with racial profiling and hurtful insults like me. I set a boundary to be followed in the future and inspired many of the greats, such as Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell, to dominate in their respective sport of basketball. Many more I influenced in other sports too. Thank you for this extra knowledge. Now finally, Mr. Robinson, what was the lasting impact of your contribution towards the game of baseball? How or why did you contribute? Excellent question. I'm glad you're interested. My legacy became well known before and after my death. I was so beloved by Dodgers fans that my jersey number 42 became retired, and I got inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. I broke the color barrier. As aforementioned, many stars of many different minorities respected me, and it influenced them when they partook in other sports. I dedicated so much of my life and respect towards baseball, and I led to future regulations allowing the admission of colored people into the MLB. I expanded the game's boundaries. My legacy helped push the civil rights movement further, and with my heroism and motivational people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, the black people were going to win. They were going to receive their social freedom. Thank you so much, and thank you again to our other 4 interviewees. I am now able to present more information to my news station, and I can learn a lot from this experience. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it from here. These 5 interviewees shaped history as we know it, and are such significant figures within our nation's timeline. I hope you have found this presentation and interviewing session helpful, and hopefully it provided insight on how important these people were. As always, I'm Sean Jenkins, and thanks for watching.